September 3rd, 1943, Chrysler Tank Arsenal, Warren, Michigan. 1847 hours. The third shift whistle blew across the floor of building number 2, and the sound cut through the mechanical thunder like a knife through cloth. Ethel Morrison wiped the oil from her hands that 6 months ago had never touched anything heavier than a typewriter, and stepped back from the M4 Sherman tank she had just helped bolt together. The tank sat complete on the production line, olive drab paint still drying, its 75mm gun elevated slightly as if already scanning for targets it would never see on this factory floor. Behind it, stretching back into the artificial twilight of the plant, sat another Sherman. And behind that another, and another. 27 tanks visible from where Morrison stood, and beyond them, in the portions of the assembly line that curved out of sight, dozens more in various stages of completion. The numbers had become so large that they had lost meaning through sheer repetition. This single factory, one of 11 major tank plants operating in the United States in 1943, would produce its 10,000th Sherman tank in November, just 14 months after opening. 10,000 tanks from one facility, built by workers who'd been housewives and farmers and shopkeepers and students before Pearl Harbor, assembled on production lines that hadn't existed 2 years earlier, using techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing and adapted to produce instruments of war at a scale that would have seemed like fantasy in 1939. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts of 8 hours each, with workers streaming in and out like tides. The sound never stopped. The pneumatic hammers, the welding torches, the massive overhead cranes moving turrets and hulls, the test engines roaring to life in the final inspection bays. Morrison walked toward the time clock, past a bulletin board that tracked production figures. Today's total, 42 tanks completed. Yesterday, 41. The week's total, 287. The month-to-date, 1,156. By the end of September, the Chrysler Tank Arsenal alone would have produced more M4 Shermans than the entire German tank industry. All of its factories, all of its manufacturers, Henschel and Mann and Daimler-Benz and Krupp combined, would produce Tigers, Panthers and Panzer Seers in the same period. And Chrysler was just one plant. The Fisher Tank Division in Grand Blanc was producing Shermans. The Federal Machine and Welder Company in Warren was producing Shermans. The Pacific Car and Foundry Company in Renton, Washington, was producing Shermans. The American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, was producing Shermans. The Baldwin Locomotive Works, the Press Steel Car Company, the Pullman Standard Car Company, all producing Shermans, all operating at capacity, all feeding an insatiable demand for armor that would equip not just American forces but British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and eventually Soviet armies as well. Morrison punched her time card, end of shift, 1850 hours, and walked out into the September evening. Behind her, the third shift was already taking positions on the line, and the 43rd tank of the day was beginning its journey from raw steel to combat vehicle, a journey that would take exactly 19 hours from the moment the first hull plate was positioned until the completed tank rolled off the final inspection line. 19 hours, repeated endlessly, producing a Sherman every 32 minutes on average, every hour of every day, a mechanical heartbeat that would not cease until victory was assured. The sound of the factory followed her into the parking lot, a continuous industrial roar that was being replicated in dozens of facilities across America, a symphony of production that was reshaping the mathematics of warfare itself, the arithmetic of destruction. To understand how the Chrysler Tank Arsenal came to outproduce the entire German tank industry, one must first understand how radically different American and German approaches to war production were, and how those differences were rooted in fundamentally divergent philosophies about manufacturing, standardization, and the very purpose of industrial capacity in wartime. Germany entered World War II with a tank force that was, in many respects, quite small. The invasion of Poland in 1939 employed approximately 2,800 tanks, many of them light Panzer I and Panzer II models that were barely adequate for combat, and which German commanders understood were stopgap measures until better designs could be produced in quantity. The stunning victory in France in 1940 was achieved with roughly 2,400 tanks, again predominantly lighter models, though the Panzer III and Panzer IV were beginning to appear in significant numbers. German tank production in those early war years was, by later standards, almost artisanal. Tanks were built in relatively small batches, with frequent design modifications and improvements incorporated into production runs. This approach reflected both the German emphasis on quality and technological superiority and the practical limitations of German industry, which lacked the massive production capacity of American automobile manufacturers. In 1940, Germany produced approximately 2,200 tanks of all types. In 1941, that number rose to about 5,200. These were respectable figures by European standards, more than Britain or the Soviet Union managed in the same period, but they reflected an industrial base that was not fully mobilized for total war. Hitler had been reluctant to place the German economy on a full war footing, partly from confidence that the war would be short, and partly from concern about civilian morale. German factories continued producing substantial quantities of consumer goods well into 1942. Rationing was implemented, but remained relatively mild compared to what would come later. The result was a war economy that was powerful but not fully committed, that sought to win through tactical and operational brilliance rather than through overwhelming material superiority. This approach worked brilliantly in the war's early years, when German forces faced enemies who were either unprepared, Poland, France, or caught by surprise, Soviet Union in 1941. It began to falter when those enemies recovered, mobilized their own industries, and demonstrated that they could absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. The turning point came in 1943, when Albert Speer, Hitler's architect turned armaments minister, finally achieved the industrial mobilization that Germany should have implemented in 1939. German tank production that year exploded to approximately 12,000 vehicles, a remarkable increase that testified to the German economy's latent capacity when fully mobilized. But by then, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The United States had entered the war, bringing with it an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Europe could muster. And more importantly, American industry had spent 1942 learning how to apply mass production techniques to military equipment, developing methods that would allow the US to produce weapons in quantities that made German increases seem almost irrelevant. The Detroit Revolution. American automobile industry in 1940 was the most productive manufacturing complex in human history. Detroit and its satellite cities produced roughly 4 million cars per year, using assembly line techniques that had been refined over 3 decades. The factories were enormous, sprawling complexes employing tens of thousands of workers, using sophisticated logistics to manage supply chains that stretched across the continent, implementing quality control processes that ensured consistency across millions of units. When the United States began preparing for war in 1940-41, the obvious question was whether these techniques could be applied to military production. Whether tanks and planes and ships could be mass-produced the way cars were. The answer was complicated. Military equipment was, in many ways, more complex than automobiles. Tolerances were tighter, specifications were more demanding, designs changed more frequently, and quality control was literally a matter of life and death. Early attempts to convert automobile plants to military production encountered significant problems. The first tanks produced using automobile industry methods had quality issues, parts that didn't fit properly, welds that failed, transmissions that broke down. There was a learning curve, and that curve cost time and produced equipment that sometimes failed in the field. But American industry learned with remarkable speed. The Ford Motor Company, which had resisted military production initially, built the Willow Run plant to produce B-24 bombers using assembly line methods, eventually achieving a production rate of 1 bomber per hour, a rate that German aviation industry planners considered literally impossible when they first heard the reports. General Motors converted numerous facilities to military production, producing everything from aircraft engines to artillery shells. And Chrysler, which had been the smallest of the big three automakers, committed to building an entirely new facility dedicated solely to tank production. The Chrysler tank arsenal was designed from the ground up to mass-produce tanks using automobile assembly techniques. Construction began in September 1940, before the United States had even entered the war, as part of the preparedness program that Roosevelt had initiated despite isolationist opposition. The facility was massive, over 1.5 million square feet of floor space, with room for multiple parallel assembly lines and all the supporting infrastructure needed for complete tank production. The building itself was a marvel of rapid construction, completed in just 6 months, using prefabricated steel sections and employing construction crews that worked around the clock. The production line was designed by K.T. Keller, Chrysler's president, who had spent his career perfecting assembly line efficiency in automobile manufacturing. His insight was that tanks, despite their complexity, could be broken down into sub-assemblies that could be manufactured in parallel, then brought together on a final assembly line in a carefully choreographed sequence. Hull sections would be welded in one area, turrets in another, suspensions assembled in a third location, engines prepared in a fourth. Each sub-assembly would move through its own production process, and all would converge at precisely the right moment on the main line, where they would be combined into finished tanks. The human assembly, the Chrysler tank arsenal, opened in July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, and immediately began producing M3 Lee tanks for the British under Lend-Lease. The workforce was unlike anything a military contractor had employed before. Approximately 40% of the workers were women, housewives, teachers, shop clerks, college students who had never worked in manufacturing but who learned quickly. African Americans were hired in significant numbers, breaking down some of the racial barriers that had characterized peacetime industry. The elderly returned to work. Men with disabilities who couldn't serve in the military found employment. The workforce was a cross-section of American society, united by the common purpose of production and by wages that were substantially higher than most had earned in peacetime. Training was intensive, but rapid. New workers went through a brief orientation, sometimes as little as a week, learning a specific task that they would repeat hundreds of times per shift. The jobs were broken down into component steps, simple enough that they could be mastered quickly, but which, when performed in sequence by thousands of workers, resulted in completed tanks. A woman who had been a secretary learned to operate a riveting gun. A farmer learned to install transmission components. A retired schoolteacher learned to wire electrical systems. The division of labor was extreme, but it was effective, allowing the plant to absorb thousands of workers with minimal training time and to maintain productivity even as the workforce turned over due to military drafts and other wartime dislocations. The scale was unprecedented. At peak production, the Chrysler tank arsenal employed over 25,000 workers across 3 shifts. The plant operated continuously, midnight to dawn, morning to afternoon, evening to midnight, an endless cycle. Workers arrived on buses, punched in, took their positions on the line, and performed their assigned tasks for 8 hours before being replaced by the next shift. The continuity was essential. Stopping the line meant losing production, and every tank not produced today was a tank that wouldn't be available for the next offensive, the next landing, the next battle. The working conditions were difficult. The noise was constant and deafening. The clang of metal on metal, the roar of engines being tested, the hiss of welding torches, the pneumatic hammer of riveting guns. The factory was hot in summer despite industrial fans, cold in winter despite heating that struggled to warm the massive space. The work was physically demanding, especially for workers handling heavy components or operating machinery that required strength and endurance. Injuries were common: cuts from sharp metal edges, burns from welding sparks, crushed fingers from heavy parts, hearing damage from the noise. The plant had a medical facility that operated around the clock, treating the inevitable accidents that came from thousands of people working with heavy machinery at high speed. But the workers came, and they stayed, and they produced. The motivation was partly economic. Defense work paid well, and many families needed the income. But it was also patriotic. These workers understood that the tanks they built would be used by their sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. They understood that production delays meant casualties, that quality failures meant deaths. The bulletin boards in the plant displayed letters from soldiers thanking the workers for the equipment that had saved their lives. Newspaper accounts of tank battles mentioned Shermans by name, and workers would look at production records to see if the tanks that fought at Kasserine or Kursk might have been ones they helped build. The numbers that defied belief, the production figures from the Chrysler tank arsenal, when examined closely, reveal the extraordinary scale of American industrial mobilization. The plant produced its first M4 Sherman in July 1942, 1 year after opening. By December 1942, it had produced 1,000 Shermans. By June 1943, that number had reached 5,000. By December 1943, it exceeded 11,000. The acceleration was geometric, reflecting both the learning curve as workers became more efficient and the continuous process. Improvements that Chrysler implemented based on feedback from the factory floor. The comparison with German production is stark and telling. In 1943, Germany produced approximately 5,166 Panzer IV tanks, their most numerous medium tank and the backbone of their armored forces. They produced approximately 1,168 Panther tanks, the sophisticated new design intended to counter Soviet T-34s. They produced 649 Tiger I heavy tanks, the fearsome vehicle that dominated battlefields wherever it appeared, but which required 300,000 man-hours to manufacture. Combined, these three types, representing the vast majority of German tank production, totaled roughly 8,383 tanks. The Chrysler tank arsenal by itself produced approximately 11,400 M4 Shermans in the same period, but Chrysler was only one of 11 major Sherman production facilities. The Fisher Tank Division in Grand Blanc, Michigan, produced roughly 4,900 Shermans in 1943. The Federal Machine and Welder Company produced approximately 2,100. The Pacific Car and Foundry Company produced around 1,000. The American Locomotive Company, the Baldwin Locomotive Works, the Pressed Steel Car Company, the Pullman Standard Car Company, all contributed thousands of additional units. The total American tank production in 1943, including Shermans and other types, exceeded 29,000 vehicles. This was more than double total German production, achieved despite Germany's head start and despite the much-vaunted German engineering expertise. The disparity extended beyond mere quantity. American tanks were designed for mass production in ways that German tanks were not. The Sherman used a radial aircraft engine, the Wright R975, or various models of Continental engines that was produced in massive quantities for other applications, and which could be easily adapted to tank use. The transmission was relatively simple and used components that were compatible across multiple Sherman variants. The suspension used vertical volute springs that were crude but extremely robust and easy to manufacture. The armor was rolled homogeneous steel that could be produced by multiple suppliers rather than requiring specialized foundries. German tanks, by contrast, were increasingly complex and difficult to manufacture. The Tiger's 88mm gun was a masterpiece of ballistics, but required specialized boring and rifling equipment. The interleaved road wheels provided excellent suspension, but were time-consuming to install and created maintenance nightmares in muddy or frozen conditions. The Panther's transmission and final drive were sophisticated but fragile, requiring precision manufacturing that slowed production. The result was tanks that were individually superior in many respects, but which could not be produced in the quantities needed to alter the strategic balance. The symbolic rivet if. There was a single object that came to represent the difference between American and German approaches to tank production. It was the rivet, or rather the choice between riveting and welding as primary hull construction methods. Early Sherman production used riveted hulls, a technique borrowed directly from ship construction and pre-war tank building. Riveting was fast, could be performed by semi-skilled workers after brief training, and produced hulls that were adequately strong for the Sherman's design parameters. The disadvantage was that rivets could become projectiles if the hull was struck by anti-tank weapons, flying through the interior and injuring crew members, even if the armor wasn't penetrated. German tanks had moved to welded construction earlier, recognizing that welding produced stronger, lighter hulls without the rivet spalling problem. But welding required more skilled labor, took longer, and demanded better quality control. As American production ramped up and combat reports identified the rivet spalling issue, American manufacturers faced a choice: continue using riveting, which was faster and easier, or convert to welding, which was better, but would slow production during the transition. The solution was characteristically American: do both. Later production Shermans were built with welded hulls, using improved techniques and trained welders. But early hulls continued to be riveted because stopping production to convert the lines was unacceptable. The riveted Shermans went to training units or to secondary theaters where they would face less sophisticated anti-tank weapons. The welded hulls went to frontline units in Europe and the Pacific. The willingness to accept two different production methods, to maintain parallel processes rather than insisting on a single optimal solution, was emblematic of American industrial flexibility. The rivet also became a symbol of something else: the ordinary object transformed by context into something significant. Workers at the Chrysler tank arsenal handled thousands of rivets per shift, each one a small cylinder of steel that would become part of a vehicle that might save American lives. The bulletin boards in the plant's break rooms carried photographs of Sherman tanks in action, and workers could see the rivets they had installed, see the hulls they had assembled, see the tangible evidence that their work mattered. One worker, interviewed for a wartime documentary, held up a rivet and said, "This little thing and 10,000 more like it become a tank. And that tank goes over there and brings our boys home. That's what we're building. We're building the way home." The statement was propaganda, certainly, designed to motivate and to celebrate American industrial achievement. But it was also true. The rivets, the welds, the thousands of components that went into each Sherman did become tanks. And those tanks did contribute to victory. And workers did have reason to believe that their labor had meaning beyond a paycheck. The connection between factory floor and battlefield was direct and visible in ways that it had never been in previous wars, when military equipment was built in distant arsenals by professional armaments workers. In World War II, American weapons were built by American civilians, and everyone understood that they were all part of the same effort. The German response. German intelligence was aware of American production figures by mid-1943, though there was considerable skepticism about their accuracy. The numbers seemed impossible. No nation could produce tanks at the rates the Americans claimed. The reports were assumed to be exaggerated, propaganda designed to demoralize. When captured, American soldiers were interrogated and confirmed that thousands of Shermans were being produced monthly. German officers concluded that the prisoners were poorly informed or had been fed misinformation. The idea that a single American factory could outproduce all of German industry violated everything German industrial planners understood about manufacturing. The reality became undeniable when German forces in North Africa, Italy, and later France encountered Shermans in quantities that made tactical success almost irrelevant. German tank units could win battles. Their Panthers and Tigers had superior guns and armor, but they couldn't win the attrition war. For every Panther destroyed, another appeared eventually. For every Sherman destroyed, 3 more appeared the next day. The mathematics were impossible to overcome. German tank commanders began to report that they were fighting not an army, but a factory. That the real enemy wasn't the American soldiers, but the American industrial system that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Albert Speer, who had achieved remarkable increases in German production by 1943, understood the implications. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The American capacity for production was something we could not match. We increased our tank production 3-fold in 1943, and we were proud of this achievement. Then we learned that the Americans had increased theirs 5-fold, and we realized that we were not competing in the same contest. They were playing a different game, one where the rules were determined by industrial capacity rather than by tactical excellence. German efforts to counter American production advantages focused on quality rather than quantity. The Panther was designed to be superior to the Sherman in every measurable way. Better gun, better armor, better mobility. The Tiger II, introduced in 1944, was even more formidable. But these sophisticated vehicles required resources that Germany increasingly lacked. Chrome for armor hardening became scarce as the Balkans were lost. Nickel supplies were cut off. Skilled labor was depleted as workers were drafted into the military. Factory complexes were targeted by Allied bombing, and while German industry showed remarkable resilience in dispersing production, the disruptions still reduced output and complicated logistics. The bombing was particularly significant because it forced German industry to disperse and operate under conditions of constant threat. Tank factories that had been concentrated in major industrial centers were moved to smaller facilities, hidden in forests or built underground. This improved survivability but reduced efficiency. The advantages of concentration and scale were lost when production was scattered across dozens of small workshops. American factories, by contrast, operated without any threat of attack, allowing them to optimize for efficiency rather than survivability. The workers at the Chrysler tank arsenal never heard air raid sirens, never hid in shelters, never arrived for their shift to find their workplace bombed overnight. They simply came to work, built tanks and went home day after day, in a security that German workers couldn't imagine by 1944. The mathematics of victory by late 1943, the cumulative production figures had created a situation where American material superiority was becoming decisive. The total number of Shermans produced by December 1943 exceeded 29,000 units. German tank production of all types from 1939 through the end of 1943 totaled approximately 32,000 units. The Americans had, in less than 2 years of tank production, built nearly as many tanks as Germany had built in over 4 years of war. And American production was accelerating, while German production was reaching its maximum sustainable rate. The strategic implications were profound. American forces could afford tactics that would have been suicidal for any other army. If a German strongpoint couldn't be bypassed, it could be overwhelmed with armor, accepting casualties that would be replaced within days. If a particular operation required concentrating hundreds of tanks in a single sector, those tanks were available. If losses in a battle were heavy, replacement vehicles arrived before the offensive momentum was lost. The Sherman, whatever its individual shortcomings compared to German heavy tanks, was available in numbers that made individual encounters almost meaningless from a strategic perspective. The production advantage also enabled the Americans to supply their allies on a scale that reshaped the entire Allied war effort. British tank production in 1943 was approximately 7,500 units, but Britain received thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease, allowing them to equip entire armored divisions with American vehicles and to focus their own production on other priorities. The Soviet Union, which produced over 24,000 tanks in 1943, still received thousands of Shermans and other American vehicles that supplemented Soviet production. The Free French, the Poles, the Canadians all equipped their armored forces primarily with American vehicles. The Sherman became the common standard, simplifying training and logistics, allowing Allied forces to operate with a degree of interoperability that the Axis never achieved. The production numbers also created a psychological effect that was difficult to quantify, but undeniably real. German soldiers understood by late 1943 that they were fighting an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. American prisoners wore uniforms that were standardized and well-made. Their equipment was plentiful and well-maintained. They had access to medical care, food, and ammunition that German forces could only envy. And they had tanks, always more tanks, arriving in endless convoys, replacing losses, building up for the next offensive. The message was clear. America could afford to fight this war indefinitely, absorbing casualties and material losses that would have crippled any European nation. Because American industrial capacity was simply on a different scale, the hidden cost, the production miracle at facilities like the Chrysler tank arsenal, came with costs that were often hidden from public view. The workers who built tanks at unprecedented rates paid a physical price. The injury rates in defense plants were significantly higher than in civilian manufacturing. The combination of dangerous machinery, high-speed production, long hours, and often inadequate safety equipment created conditions where accidents were common. The official figures showed thousands of injuries per month across American defense industries, from minor cuts and burns to catastrophic accidents involving crushing or amputation. The psychological toll was also significant. Many workers, particularly women who had not worked in manufacturing before, found the factory environment overwhelming. The noise, the heat, the repetitive labor, the pressure to maintain production rates, the awareness that mistakes could result in equipment failures that might kill soldiers. Turnover rates were high, with workers leaving for health reasons or simply unable to sustain the pace. The plants maintained large recruitment programs, constantly bringing in new workers to replace those who left, training them rapidly and inserting them into the production line. The communities around defense plants also paid a price. Warren, Michigan, where the Chrysler tank arsenal was located, saw its population explode as workers moved in seeking employment. Housing was inadequate, leading to overcrowding, shantytowns, and stress on municipal services. Schools were overwhelmed. Hospitals struggled to keep up with demand. Roads deteriorated under the weight of increased traffic. The boom was economically beneficial but socially disruptive, creating tensions and problems that would persist long after the war ended. There was also a racial dimension that complicated the narrative of unified national effort. African-American workers at defense plants faced discrimination in hiring and job assignments, often relegated to the most difficult and dangerous positions. Housing discrimination meant that black workers struggled to find places to live near the plants. Race riots erupted in several cities, including Detroit in 1943, when racial tensions over housing and employment boiled over into violence. The production miracle was real, but it occurred within a society that remained deeply unequal. And the benefits of defense employment were not distributed fairly. The transformation of perception For American workers who participated in defense production, the experience was transformative in ways that would shape post-war American society. Women who had been housewives discovered that they could operate complex machinery, could earn substantial wages, could contribute directly to the war effort in ways that society had told them they couldn't. The famous Rosie the Riveter imagery was propaganda, but it reflected a real phenomenon: millions of women entering the industrial workforce and discovering capabilities they had been taught to ignore or suppress. The post-war assumption that these women would simply return to domestic life proved incorrect for many. The experience of economic independence, of doing work that mattered, of being part of a collective effort larger than themselves, changed how women viewed their own potential. The seeds of the feminist movements that would emerge in the 1960s were planted in part in factories like the Chrysler tank arsenal, where women learned that they were as capable as men when given the opportunity and training. For the broader American public, the production achievements of facilities like Chrysler became a source of national pride that reinforced American exceptionalism. The United States hadn't just defeated its enemies militarily. It had outproduced them so dramatically that victory became inevitable. This narrative, that American industrial capacity was the decisive factor in World War II, became embedded in national mythology and shaped how Americans understood their role in the world. The belief that American economic power could solve problems, could overwhelm obstacles through sheer scale, became a foundational assumption of Cold War policy and remained influential into the 21st century. For Germany, the realization of American productive capacity was deeply disturbing and forced a fundamental reassessment of the war. By 1944, even Hitler acknowledged that Germany was losing the production war, though he continued to believe that new wonder weapons might reverse the tide. German soldiers and officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs repeatedly returned to the theme of American material superiority, describing it in terms that suggested awe tinged with resentment. They had believed that German quality would triumph over quantity, that superior tactics and technology would overcome material disadvantages. The Sherman proved them wrong, not because it was a superior tank in individual encounters, but because there were so many of them that individual encounters became strategically meaningless. The echo through time. The legacy of American tank production in World War II extended far beyond the immediate military victory. The techniques developed in facilities like the Chrysler tank arsenal, the assembly line methods, the just-in-time logistics, the quality control systems, the rapid training of semi-skilled workers would be applied to post-war consumer goods production, contributing to the post-war boom that made America the world's wealthiest nation. The defense industries that had proven themselves during the war became the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower would warn about, the permanent arms industry that would define Cold War America. The Sherman tank itself became a symbol, appearing in films and photographs as the representative American armored vehicle, even though its combat record was mixed and it was eventually replaced by more sophisticated designs. What the Sherman represented: American production capacity, the ability to build weapons in overwhelming quantity, the philosophy that adequacy deployed en masse beats excellence deployed sparingly, became part of how Americans understood their military power. The Vietnam War, with its reliance on firepower and material superiority, was in some ways an attempt to apply the same principles, though with far less success. The Chrysler tank arsenal itself was converted to other production after the war, building trucks and automobiles as the company returned to civilian manufacturing. The building stood for decades as a physical reminder of the wartime mobilization, though most people passing it had no idea of its history. In the 1990s, portions of the facility were demolished, the industrial space repurposed for modern manufacturing, or left vacant as the American automobile industry declined. The workers who had built tanks there were elderly or dead. Their experiences remembered primarily in archives and oral histories. Part of a generation that had fought and won the largest war in human history, and then built the most prosperous society the world had ever seen. The final accounting, the ultimate Sherman production totals, when finally calculated after the war ended, revealed the full scale of American industrial achievement. From 1942 through 1945, American factories produced 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks. This figure doesn't include other American tank types, the M3 Lee, the M5 Stuart, the M26 Pershing, the various specialized variants. It doesn't include the thousands of tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery pieces, and armored vehicles that used Sherman components. It represents just the standard medium tank, the basic combat vehicle that equipped American armored divisions and was supplied to allies around the world. Germany's total tank production from 1939 through 1945 was approximately 67,000 vehicles of all types, including tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers. This figure covered 6 years of war, included the production of obsolete types, and represented the output of German industry at maximum mobilization, with resources drawn from across conquered Europe. The Americans produced nearly 3/4 of Germany's total output in just 4 years, while also building the world's largest navy, producing over 300,000 aircraft, manufacturing millions of trucks and jeeps, supplying their allies through Lend-Lease, and maintaining domestic civilian production at levels that Germany couldn't approach. The comparison is not quite fair. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts from 1941 onward, was subjected to strategic bombing that disrupted production, and lacked access to raw materials that America had in abundance. But that's precisely the point. The American production achievement was possible because America had resources, security, and industrial infrastructure that its enemies lacked. The ability of facilities like the Chrysler tank arsenal to operate at full capacity without interruption, to draw on continental resources, to employ workers who didn't fear for their lives, to implement efficient processes without having to constantly adapt to bombing and sabotage. These advantages were decisive. The tank production story is ultimately a story about systems and capacity. The Sherman wasn't a better tank than the Panther in most measurable ways, but the system that produced Shermans, the factories, the workers, the supply chains, the training programs, the logistics networks, the financial resources, the political will, was vastly superior to the system that produced Panthers. And in modern industrial warfare, systems matter more than individual weapons. The most sophisticated tank in the world is useless if there are only a few dozen available, and no fuel to run them, and no spare parts to repair them, and no trained crews to operate them. The adequate tank that's available by the thousands, supported by fuel and spare parts, and crewed by trained personnel, wins. The poet's truth: there is a photograph from the Chrysler tank arsenal, taken in late 1943, that captures something essential about what that factory represented. The photograph shows a portion of the assembly line, a perspective shot looking down the length of the building, with completed Sherman tanks stretching into the distance, their hulls catching the industrial lighting, creating a pattern of metal and shadow that looks almost artistic. In the foreground, barely visible, are two workers, a woman and a man, their faces turned away from the camera, focused on some task that the photo doesn't reveal. The scale is what strikes viewers, the vastness of the space, the number of tanks, the evidence of production on a scale that seems almost incomprehensible. What the photograph doesn't capture is the sound, the continuous industrial roar that defined the plant 24 hours a day. That sound was the sound of American power being manufactured, of industrial capacity being converted into military force, of a nation's productive potential being fully realized. It was a sound that German soldiers could hear metaphorically in the rumble of Sherman columns advancing across France. It was a sound that Japanese soldiers could hear in the naval gunfire that preceded every American landing in the Pacific. It was the sound that defined the war's outcome more surely than any tactical victory or defeat. The workers who created that sound, the Ethel Morrisons and thousands like them, probably didn't think of themselves as making history. They thought of themselves as doing a job, earning a wage, supporting the war effort, contributing to something larger than themselves. But they were making history, were proving that democracy and industrial capitalism could mobilize resources on a scale that totalitarian regimes couldn't match, were demonstrating that free societies didn't need slave labor or conquered populations to achieve productive miracles. The tanks that rolled off the Chrysler assembly line were products of choice. Workers chose to take those jobs, chose to do that labor, chose to work those hours. They weren't coerced or conscripted or forced. They were paid, and many stayed for years because the work had meaning. That choice, replicated millions of times across American defense industries, was the foundation of Allied victory. The Nazis believed that only through total state control could maximum production be achieved, that individual liberty was incompatible with military efficiency. The Chrysler tank arsenal, producing more tanks than all of Germany in 1943, proved them catastrophically wrong. Freedom and abundance weren't weaknesses to be exploited. They were strengths that, when mobilized, created productive capacity that authoritarian systems couldn't approach. Ethel Morrison, who helped bolt together Shermans in September 1943, never knew whether any of the tanks she built were the ones that liberated concentration camps or crossed the Rhine or met Soviet forces at the Elbe. The tanks weren't individually identified. To the workers who built them, they were just production units, numbers on a tally sheet. But somewhere in Europe, some of those tanks fought, and some of their crews survived, because the tank held together when it was hit, because the engine kept running, because the gun fired when needed, because the thousands of rivets and welds and components were installed correctly by workers who cared about quality, even in the midst of quantity production. That care, that attention to craft, even in mass production, was the final difference. The Germans built their tanks with engineering precision, with sophisticated systems, with an emphasis on technological superiority. The Americans built their tanks with industrial efficiency, with standardized components, with an emphasis on quantity and reliability. But the Americans also built them with the understanding that soldiers' lives depended on quality, that every tank represented someone's son or brother or husband or father, that production numbers were meaningless if the equipment didn't work when needed. The combination of quantity and adequate quality, produced at a pace that made tactical defeats recoverable and strategic victory inevitable, was the formula that won the war, and it was forged on factory floors like the one at Chrysler Tank Arsenal, where the third shift whistle blew every evening at 1850 hours, and workers punched out and went home, and the next shift took their places on the line. And the 43rd tank of the day continued its 19-hour journey from raw steel to combat vehicle. And the sound of production never stopped, never faltered. A mechanical heartbeat that measured out the rhythm of victory in units completed per hour, day after day, until the enemy's capacity to resist was ground down beneath the weight of American industrial abundance, made manifest in olive-drab steel.